Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we try to turn you on to great theories, earth-shattering discoveries, and grand unified theories that you probably have never heard of before. But if you did, they would make a big impact on your life. Today is our 183rd Bible Decode. Everything coming from the New Testament. We've been looking into the Roman origins hypothesis to the New Testament, that the New Testament was written in whole or in part by the Romans, by the Caesars, and in particular the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty. That is Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, from 69 until 96 AD. They, both Vespasian and Titus, had just gotten out of a war. They had been the military commanders in the Jewish War from 66 until 73 or maybe even 74 AD. And they were both wounded in the war, in fact, and they were both real tired of dealing with the Jews, because the Jews had been a thorn in the side of the Romans for over 130 years, dealing with them ever since the Romans took over in Judea in about 63 BC. And the Jews had all of these quirky idiosyncratic beliefs, including the monotheistic, jealous, zealous God who called them the chosen people, leading to xenophobia and separatism. And then they had their God was obsessive compulsive disorder and addicted to smoking animal fat, and had a streak of being arbitrary and capricious and indecisive, and that led to all of these Jewish rituals and strictures, and that they had to comply with. The circumcision, all the kosher food laws, the stricture against graven images, and the animal sacrifice rituals. And so this was a big pain for the Romans. So Vespasian and Titus, I think, were the culmination of a much longer plot by the Romans, one of psychological operation or a psychological warfare against the Jews. They took advantage of the fact that they knew the Jews were waiting for a Messiah. The Jews were waiting for a military commander that would help them throw off the yoke of the Romans. And three kind of pretenders, Messiah pretenders, actually came to the fore in 66 AD, Simon, John, and Eleazar, and they kicked out Herod Agrippa, one of the client kings of Rome, sent him packing back to Rome, causing Emperor Nero to send in General Vespasian to quell the revolt. And that's what led to the Jewish War. Eventually, after 7 long years, 3.5 from Vespasian and 3.5 from his son Titus, once Vespasian was named to be the new emperor, the Romans ended up slaughtering the Jews and destroying Jerusalem under General Titus. But it was not without major cost to the Romans, and it was not without recognizing that the Jews would come back and be resilient. And in fact, they did, even with the psychological operation, the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132. So that was, over almost 60 years, but nonetheless, the Romans knew it was coming eventually, despite of how they decimated decimated the Jews. And so they instead wrote a story of a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace, and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, walking the extra mile with the Roman soldiers' pack, turning the other cheek to oppression, and believing that the Roman soldier, slave-owning, uncircumcised centurion was the possessor of the greatest faith in all of Israel, and asking his God to forgive the Romans. So at the same time, this Jewish Messiah went outside the temple and overturned the tables of the Jewish money changers who were trying to provide kosher money to pay for the animal sacrifice of the entrepreneurs who were out there selling small animals that Jesus also condemned. So Jesus is taking direct aim at the Jewish rituals, which the Romans hated so much because they were such high maintenance for the Romans. And he also was completely deferential to the Romans. Now, this provides the motive, the method. The Romans had created a number of other religions here in the first century for psychological purposes. And the Romans had a monopoly on censorship, on publishing, and on distribution. No one was publishing anything in the Roman Empire unless Caesar approved of it. And so they wrote these Gospels because they were the only ones who could have written them. The first red flag should be that they were written in Greek, a language of Rome, much more so than Judea, where they would have been speaking it. And if they knew how to write, they would have been writing in Aramaic. But at the same time that they wrote these Gospels, the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they also wrote a history of this war against the Jews called the Jewish War. And they wrote under the name of Josephus, who was a member of the Flavian dynasty, an adopted member, originally a Jew, captured by Vespasian. Vespasian got him somehow to recognize that that God now favors the Romans and not the Jews, causing Josephus to defect to the Romans, and to give Vespasian the star prophecy, saying that one day you will become the new emperor. When Vespasian did become the new emperor, he pardoned Josephus, brought him back to Rome, and gave him a job as one of the court historians, set him up at a townhouse at Caesar's palace, where he lived the rest of his days, 30 years or more. And Josephus, if you believe that story, wrote this 7-volume Jewish War, which is very interesting if you read it, because there are so many parallels between Jewish War and the New Testament that it is rather obvious that they were written by the same people at the same time for the same reason. Whoever Josephus was, we don't know, but I mean, most historians claim that he was a real person somehow, in spite of reading his autobiography. But whoever Josephus was, he emanated from Rome. The source of his writing was from Rome, and he was endorsed by Titus. And whoever he was also the person who wrote the Gospels, or the people who wrote the Gospels. There are so many parallels. To start with, the 3-year ministry of Jesus in the New Testament is an exact mirror of the 3-year military campaign of Titus described by Josephus in the War of the Jews. Every place that Titus goes in Judea, Jesus also goes. And they go there in the same order. And they encounter parallel events at each location that are spaced at 40 years apart exactly. And we're not talking about just a couple of events. We're talking about 40 to 45 events that are all in the same order in both books. We'll also see that all of the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament are fulfilled in the pages of the War of the Jews, particularly his major prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem. And like many of his other prophecies, the destruction of Jerusalem was fulfilled by Titus. And Jesus says in that prophecy that the destruction will signal the second coming of Jesus. So right there in the War of the Jews, you can see that Titus is the second coming of Jesus. Not somebody that we're waiting for here in the 21st century. It happened 1,952 years ago, or 1,955 years ago. Also, that all that stuff was kind of documented by Joseph Atwill in his book Caesar's Messiah, and that came out about 20 years ago. Just recently, Michael Menescotts has a new book called Christianity's Origins as a Flavian Secrecy Cult, and he goes into the book of Luke looking for parallels with Josephus and finds over 250 of them just in the book of Luke. And meaning Luke is completely saturated with parallels from Josephus. And some of them are really powerful and mean-spirited, mocking, ridiculing, and worse. Some of them are more offhand and could be dismissed as coincidence, except that there are hundreds of others. And so I would guess that of those 250, the vast majority of them were intentional parallels. And he shows this by graphing them on a chart, putting the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis. He plots a point. Every place there is a parallel, and after plotting the 250 plus points, he has created 5 near perfect letters of the same size in Latin, the language of the Roman royals. They spoke both Greek and Latin, and wrote in both Greek and Latin. APTVS, Titus Vespasian, and the AP may stand for Arius Piso, which I think possibly is pronounced Peso, P-I-S-O, or possibly Agion Pneuma, which Pneuma with the silent P, which means the Holy Spirit, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Regardless, the main point is that the Romans not only wrote the book of Luke, but they signed their name to it. And if that's not enough evidence for you, we also we will be going over the book of Luke chapter by chapter and going over all of these parallels on this channel eventually through the book of Luke. But what we've been looking at is kind of showing how the Roman origins hypothesis answers all the questions that Christian apologists cannot answer. Christian apologists often just say, well, there is no other explanation, and so we can now bring in that supernatural explanation that God did it or Jesus did something supernatural, a miracle or a virgin birth or a resurrection. And since there is no better explanation, that's the perfect place to put a supernatural explanation. But with the Roman origins hypothesis, there is always a very rational explanation, and that is that the Romans created the whole thing as fiction in order to, as part of a psychological warfare operation against the Jews, which is exactly right down the alley of their MO, and which had very strong motives, and they were the only people who had the opportunity to do so. So if you dismiss the Roman origins hypothesis, you're not really interested in the truth. Now, you can look, if you go get yourself a copy of Josephus, and you can look for the parallels for yourself. If you are able to dismiss those parallels, then that's one thing, but just dismissing the entire theory is very foolish. I saw a Christian apologist do that with, especially looking at the material that Roman Piso wrote, and Roman Peso, possibly. So he is a little bit arrogant because he's mastered Hebrew and Greek and Latin and Aramaic, and he kind of says, well, if you can't read all these languages, then you're not even, like, why even bother, but that's what he does, is basically like detective work, forensic detective work, which is something that historians don't really probably appreciate very well, where he's looking for scraps. I'm a historian, I'm an American historian, but when I was writing my dissertation, I had to use that kind of a historical method because I was writing on a topic that wasn't well documented. And so you have to look for, any scrap or piece and piece it together with another scrap that you found over there and so on. And that's kind of how he puts together his theory, where he describes that Arius Piso or Peso was the true author, writing under the name of Josephus. But this Christian apologist is kind of like ripping apart Peso's theory about Arius Piso, because Arius Peso never really appears in the historical record. He writes under a million different aliases. And Roman Peso looks at all of the letters that he wrote back and forth, the correspondence between other Roman royals, and figures out who is who. And this was a game that the Romans played. And I think it's totally a legitimate method, but he is dismissed by this apologist, and he dismisses, Arius Piso, but that's not the point. Who cares whether it's Arius Peso or not? It still emanated from the Romans. Maybe it was Tacitus, maybe it was Pliny the Younger, maybe it was Titus or Vespasian, or maybe there really was a Josephus. It doesn't matter. It came from the Romans, but you obfuscated and you diverted the whole question, and so you targeted this Arius Piso angle, and that's not enough to dismiss the Roman origins hypothesis. It's just enough to dismiss that there's this one guy did it. So anyway, we know it came from Rome. And the proof is in the pudding. Jesus, and much less Paul, never says a damn word that goes against the Romans, while both of them are and the apostles too, and they're ruthlessly damning the Jews throughout. So anyway, now we're looking at a book called Nailed, and I still forgot to look for the author. I'll get that. But this is a book of more atheist perspective, which is, I think atheism is just as bad as Christianity, if not worse. I also would refer to it as scientism. These are people that think that, if some pharmaceutical company tells you to roll up your sleeve, that you should just do it without any question, and that they capitalize the words climate change. It's amazing how people can be critical on one half of their life and totally uncritical on the other half. That's what we really have going right now. One group of people is totally critical of one aspect of life and totally uncritical about another, and the other is totally uncritical about the latter, but totally critical about the former. Anyway, so this atheist perspective, I think is, misses a lot also because they're not aware of the Roman origins hypothesis. Now, where we left off, he was talking about how that the New Testament claims that, when so-called Jesus died, there was darkness over all the land for 3 hours, and there was a renting of the curtain, and 2 earthquakes, and a mass resurrection of many dead Jewish saints. And he's like, well, if all those things happened, wouldn't it have been recorded in history? Which is a good point. I mean, Christians vastly are overconfident. They're overconfident in the level of evidence that they think that there is for the existence of Jesus, because there isn't any. I would love if a Christian would present me with any evidence for the existence of Jesus. All of the evidence is Roman. It's all coming from the Romans, from the Caesars. And we know that that is not credible because they were running a psychological operation. So he says everyone in history but Matthew simply forgot about an incident like this. He says Matthew and John's Gospels both end with Jesus still on earth. Mark also, most scholars believe that Mark ends at verse 8 of chapter 16, and that the last 12 verses of Mark are fraudulent. I believe they talk about a woman having written it. So the ascension account in Mark is in those 12 verses. So he's really saying that the ascension story is not in Matthew, John, or Mark. So it's just in Luke. Now he's talking about all of the historians and people who have commented on Jesus in one way or another. Josephus is really the only person that's commented on Jesus from the 1st century. A bunch of other Romans in the 2nd century, such as Tacitus, Thallus, Lucian. Now, the dates for Thallus, I think, are under dispute. Suetonius is 2nd century, Pliny the Younger, late 1st, early 2nd century. Now, this Mara bar Serapion, I'm not familiar with. It's supposed to be a Syrian letter writer. and Phlegon, another Roman. And then, much later, in the late 2nd century, we have Justin Martyr. He might have been a little bit earlier, 2nd century. And also Clement of Rome, who was a direct relative of Titus. I believe he was Titus's nephew, maybe cousin. He was the Bishop of Rome, possibly either the 2nd or 3rd Pope. And Polycarp was another one of the church fathers. Roman Peso says that all of the church fathers were written by Arius Peso. Origin, including ones that existed in the future, like that existed in the 2nd or 3rd century. They were all written to make it look like there was a lot of activity going on in Christianity when there really wasn't, because their psychological operation, it didn't quite take. It worked, but it didn't quite take in the 2nd century, late 1st, early 2nd century. They wrote the Gospels originally as plays to be performed in front of people. It didn't catch on. Like, it was promoted heavily and so on, but did not kind of make a huge impression all the way up until the early 4th century. But he talks about Origen, Cyprian of Carthage, Eusebius, Tertullian, St. Ignatius. That's a little earlier period. Clement of Alexandria, not to be confused with Clement of Rome. He was late 2nd, early 3rd century. Hippolytus of Rome. So all of these people are Romans, even if they weren't, they're writing 100 years after the events were supposed to have occurred. And Christian apologists generally brag about that's good. Oh, it was only 100 years. That's not enough time for legends to build up. Well, but it is enough for fiction to build up. Polycarp was earlier than I thought. 69 to 155, it says here. Justin Martyr is like middle 2nd century. Lucian, middle to late 2nd century. Then Tertullian, late 2nd, early 3rd. Origen, early 3rd. And the rest of them are even later than that. And Thales, we don't know when he lived. Phlegon, 2nd century, mid-2nd century. So anyway, none of these people, and now this Mara bar Serapion, very little known apart from the context of his single surviving letter, dating from as early as the late 1st century to all the way up to the early 4th century. Regardless, none of these people were anywhere close to the events, being eyewitnesses to the events. But he also brings up that the Gospels are not written by people who were eyewitnesses to the events either, even though some apologists do claim that Matthew was written, but you can see that Matthew is pretty much just copying Mark, and Mark is getting the point of view from Peter. And so why would, if Matthew was an actual eyewitness to the events and Mark wasn't, why would Matthew, 90% of Matthew is copied right from Mark? And so why would Matthew be copying Mark if Matthew was actually there and Mark wasn't? And Luke wasn't there. Luke was a doctor, so-called, who was a friend of Paul's. Now, I'm not sure how he dismisses John, but John was much, much later. So it's a different John. But some Christian apologists say that John was written earlier, not later. I believe Barbara Thiering also says that, the woman who dissects the Dead Sea Scrolls and ends up, kind of harmonizing them with the Gospels, which is, I think, almost the opposite. So anyway, he makes the point that these, he says, none of the so-called testimonies that of all those different authors are very impressive, and most of the testimonies, they are discussing Christians, not Christs. They're talking about the group of Christians that they have seen or whatever, not about the actual Jesus figure. Now he's talking about all the important figures who never mentioned Jesus, and he cites a lot of Romans, and I would assume, and it looks like these people are people who were writing earlier than Josephus. Epictetus, Pomponius, Mela, Martial, Juvenal, Seneca the Younger. I believe that Seneca the Younger was executed by Nero in 65 AD, and according to Peso, he was one of the original writers of the Book of Mark, and along with Lucius Piso, I believe, and they presented it to Nero as, let's do this psychological operation, and Nero said no, and so they tried to kill Nero, and Nero found out about it, and he executed Seneca, even though Seneca was originally his tutor. Gallio, Seneca the Elder, Pliny the Elder. Now, Pliny the Younger was definitely in on it. But all of these people were, Plutarch is suggested, that is Arius Piso or Peso, along with Philo of Alexandria. But all of these people were writing a little bit earlier in the first century. And that's probably, except for Seneca the Younger. And so that is probably why they didn't mention Jesus, because it was before the operation started. He talks about how there is a correspondence between Seneca and Paul that is out there that scholars have figured out that is a forgery. Interestingly, Seneca, his brother,